Much has been said about the controversial 2020 presidential election. On the one hand, you have some who claim that the election was stolen and illegitimate, pointing to numerous irregularities and instances of alleged wrongdoing that surfaced during the election and in its aftermath. On the other hand, there are others who assert that the 2020 election was safe and secure, and although there were some sporadic instances of voter fraud, it was not remotely sufficient to have any material impact on the ultimate result. In his new film, right-wing commentator Dinesh D'Souza attempts to weave together the so-called sporadic instances of fraud into a singular mosaic of a conspiratorial operation to manufacture the winner for the office of the most powerful person on the planet. He does this by laying out each fragment of the puzzle piece by piece. The film alleges that there are three primary elements of this scheme. First, you have the collectors who gather ballots through a variety of illicit means. These collectors then drop off the ballots at nonprofit organizations referred to as stash houses. The so-called stash houses then hand off the ballots to carriers referred to as mules, who then mail in the completed ballots at various drop-off locations. And it is this last prong which is the primary focus of the film, uncovering footage of purported illegal ballot trafficking in key states that determined the 2020 presidential election. The evidence comes from the findings of True the Vote, who, according to Wikipedia, is a conservative vote monitoring organization based in Houston, Texas, whose stated objective is to stop voter fraud. In its investigations, True the Vote purchased 10 trillion signals of cell phone data from key swing states. Cell phone data signals can identify the cell phone owner's location at any given time and typically is used by companies for marketing purposes. That data was then filtered for people that traveled outside their typical patterns to at least 10 mail-in Dropbox locations and at least 5 or more stash houses during the period beginning on October 1st through the election, November 3rd, which resulted in over 2,000 individual hits. True the Vote set this criteria to, in their words, prevent false positives, which might arise from incidental contacts with these locations. And in many instances, the number of drop boxes and stash houses visited by individuals was actually much higher. In one example, a purported mule visited 28 drop boxes and 5 stash houses in one day. True the Vote also obtained surveillance footage of the drop boxes recorded by state and local governments. The footage appears to show instances of individuals stuffing multiple ballots into the drop boxes, oftentimes in the middle of the night at 1 or 3 a.m. Some of the mules also used gloves and snapped pictures, allegedly to obtain proof of delivery for payment. Although this footage by itself appears to be compelling evidence of wrongdoing, in the film they only showed single instances of carriers dropping off ballots. This evidence would have been much more persuasive if the film tied together the geolocation tracking data with multiple instances of mules being caught on camera dropping off ballots at different locations. We should also note that ballot harvesting, or delivering ballots on behalf of others, is permitted in certain states. Now, paying third parties to deliver the ballots is not legal in any state, but the film highlights only one informant who alleged that they were in fact paid for delivery. The film's case would have been much more compelling if there were other confessions or other evidence of paid delivery, which is central to the crime allegedly to have been committed. The film also lays out evidence of illicit collection of ballots, most of which was already public knowledge. There have been known instances of people being paid to collect ballots, which is illegal, dead and invalid people voting, and votes being cast on behalf of those that have already moved out of state. However, the film doesn't delve very deeply into the non-profit organizations who are the hubs of this alleged operation. The film does discuss the unprecedented amount of money that was dished out by Mark Zuckerberg, George Soros, and others to, among other things, build these drop-off boxes and encourage mail-in voting in blue areas. But the film does not directly tie those efforts to the so-called stash houses that were purportedly paying the collectors and mules. In fact, although they apparently have the locations of all of these organizations, they do not name a single one in the film. Now, perhaps there are valid reasons for that, whether it be legal liability or ongoing investigations, but given that these organizations are apparently the brains of the operation, the limited dive into the actual details surrounding them feels somewhat lacking. That being said, overall, with respect to the evidence it does present, the film at a minimum raises a red flag. Even if there's only a single provable instance of a person being paid to illegally collect and mail ballots, That by itself implies the existence of a larger criminal operation, since there would be very little incentive for anyone to engage in these types of activities on a small scale. And according to the data True and Vote collected, the breadth and scope of the scheme was significant. The number of ballots delivered by the alleged Mules would have potentially been enough to change the outcome of the election. Now, of course, we don't know who was actually indicated in these ballots, and at this point, it would be impossible to track. But 2,000 Mules doesn't actually make the case that the election should be overturned. Rather, it uses that election as an example to illuminate how so-called sporadic instances of fraud can add up and result in massive consequences. In that regard, Mules is more reasonably viewed as a rebuttal to the often parroted talking point that our elections are safe and secure. How does anyone actually know that for certain? There are clear and present vulnerabilities in the system which must be addressed with real measures. Undoubtedly, these efforts will be met by cries of voter suppression. But if we care about the legitimacy of our elections, which is the bedrock of our democracy, it is vital that we take all necessary steps to ensure that they truly are secure.